Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir rahmanir rahim. First of all, just thank you to anyone who gave me this wonderful opportunity to come speak here. It's a real honor to come speak at ISBCC. It's such a vibrant community, and I know a lot of people who are way more prestigious and knowledgeable than myself have sat up here in front of this community, so I take this responsibility and this opportunity with a lot of humility. And the last thing I'll say before I start is, for those who don't know me, I'm not really like a religious scholar. A lot of my work is about education, and I have training as a psychologist, so a lot of my work is around working in schools, specifically here in Boston Public Schools. I train a lot of teachers. So I think a lot about education, I think a lot about psychology, I think a lot about our kids, and I also think a lot about issues of race as it relates to those issues of schooling and our children's development, okay? So that's what I want to talk a little bit about today, and thinking about what that does look like, could look like, should look like in our community, in the Muslim community, right? So where I'll start is, there's a lot, I'll start from here. I mean, we know as Muslims, right, that it's built into it's hard to I'll start from here. It's hard to talk about race, and it's hard to talk about racism, okay, and I know that, okay, so I just want to put that out there up front. And what we do know as Muslims, right, and what's beautiful about our deen and what's built into our deen is that we know that Allah doesn't care what race we are. We know that. We know that, we know that Allah is judging people by their character and by their piousness and by their, how much they fear Allah, right? And not by whether we're black or white or from this country or that country. We know that. That's part of the deen, right? But it's also part of our test, right? I'm just going to paraphrase or read the interpretation of the translation of Surah Al-Hujurat, verse 13. O you men, or O mankind, surely we created you of male and a female, and made you of tribes and families that you may know each other. Surely the most honorable of you with Allah is one among you who is most careful in his duty. Surely Allah is most knowing, aware, right? So this is a pretty common, a famous verse from the Quran that we know, right? And we often cite this verse as, something that's direct message from Allah, right? This message that, look, we have a test, right? It's a test. On the one hand, it's beautiful. He's created such a diversity of us in so many different ways. He's created such a diversity of so many things. But he's created so much diversity amongst us in terms of, again, race, ethnicity, nationality, gender. He's made us diverse. And part of the test is for us to not fall into the really easy, simple human trap of making those differences, right? Those differences, that diversity, real, right? Making those things actually real, okay? And of course, there's certain differences that, and that's part of what it is. Part of what he said is he made us into, into tribes and families that we may know one another, right? So he made us into these different groups so that we could come and get to know one another. But it's a test. It's hard, right? Because in some ways, when we're grouped into these different groups, it's really easy and human, and this is from a psychology perspective, it's really easy and human to start making those differences bigger than they really are, right? In other words, instead of making them into like these wonderful opportunity to meet somebody different, and to get to know someone who's not from, our tribe or our family or whatever, it turns into, this is my tribe, that's yours, right? And this is it's a quite, unfortunately, very simple human thing to do, and that's why this is such a test. If it was so easy, right? This isn't easy, and so what I love about this masjid, and just as a convert to Islam, as an American, Islam has been the masjid. I think the first masjid I ever really went to was ISB in Cambridge, and it was the first place where I went, where I actually saw this notion of like the multicultural, the multiracial America that we always hear about. It was the first place that I actually really saw it. It was the first place where I went, and in the same place there was white people, black people, Middle Eastern, South Asian, West African, East African. It was the first place where, Eastern European. It was the first place where I went to, where I truly experienced a multiracial, multicultural environment. And so in that regard, for me, Islam has just been such a blessing. But I also think that part of being a Muslim is speaking truth when you see it, trying to create justice where it's needed, right? And understanding that yes, while Islam gives us clear guidance about knowing one another, treating one another nicely, no race, not really treating each other different on the basis of race or whatever, that we are human beings and that we make mistakes and we fall into errors, right? And we have to work on that. And what I'm a little concerned, and what I want to talk about a little bit today is I think sometimes what happens when we talk about race in Islam, we sort of say, oh, we're Muslim, right? We're not racist, right? Or there's no racism in Islam, right? And there is no racism in Islam, right? But we're people, right? And we live in context. And context, and again, this is my psychology perspective. I'm gonna talk about our kids in a second, our children in a second. But as people, we're sponges, right? We're sponges in terms of whatever context we put ourselves in. It's really easy for us to just take in all those messages, all those ideas, all those values, unless we're thinking or striving really hard not to, especially if we don't want to, or to take them in if we do. And unfortunately, one of the great things about this country is that what I just said, this is a place in the United States, in our masajid, where we actually have a lot of interaction and across race and ethnicity. But we also live in a country that has a huge history around race and a huge history around racism, and ways in which race and racism still matter in our country, right? And even my own children, and I'm just going to use my own children as an example to show you how, when we talk about racism, I think a lot of times we think of like somebody evil, right? Somebody going, ooh, ha, ha, I hate that person, or I don't want to be with that person, right? That's the pretty simplest, easiest version of racism that, for the most part, we can handle, right? That person's crazy, they get fired, they lose their job, whatever it is, they get shunned and they're done, right? But that's the easy, simple racism. The hard racism, right, is where nobody has any bad intentions, right? Everybody might even have good intentions, right? No one's trying to do anything bad to anybody, but we're still getting some weird outcomes, right? And so when we think about racism, we may not always have to think about intentions, right? Sometimes we have to think about outcomes, and I'll give you an example of what that might look like, just as an example, right? So I'm going to use a non-racial example, okay? So we could imagine that I'm just going to use school as an example. If schools decided, they had really good reasons, they weren't trying to hurt anybody, right? But they just decided, look, we're going to have all parent-school parent-teacher conferences during the workday, right? Between the hours of 9 and 3, right? They might have a really good reason for it, but what ends up happening is any parent who works, between 9 and 3, they can't go, okay? And so what it does is, even with good intentions, even if whatever good reasons, right, why the school or the school system or the teachers decided to have this policy of having, parent-teacher conferences during work hours, it created this outcome where anybody who had a working parent, it created a real hardship on them, right? So maybe the intention was fine, but the outcome was such that working families, anybody who could, anyone who has, it was going to have a disproportionate outcome, right, on parents who work during the day versus parents who don't, okay? And so despite the intention, the policy is a problem because it creates a disproportionate impact on the parents who can't go during the day. It's a similar thing with race. This is how racism works, right? Gone are the days in the United States, right, where people are overtly saying, black people have to live here. You can't have this job. It's, things like that. You can or can't vote. Those days are gone. We don't have to deal with that anymore, right? But if anyone's turned on the news at all in the last, month, right, these issues of race in our country have not gone away, right? And so we see for example, with the issues of police brutality in the United States with African American males, black males, where regardless of whether individual police officers or a group of police officers do or don't think whatever about black males, we're seeing an outcome where black males are disproportionately getting stopped by the police, killed by police, killed as they're unarmed, right? And so we can sit there and look at each little case and think, well, what was this officer thinking? What was his intention? What was this officer? Is this officer racist? Right? We can keep doing it that way, but then it sort of stands in the face of mountains of evidence that shows that, for example, black males are disproportionately getting harassed by police officers. Okay, so do you guys get the difference? So even if all the police officers are just like have the best intentions in the world, but we're still creating this outcome where mostly and disproportionately black people are getting impacted negatively by policies, that's a problem. And that's why you see a lot of black folks out there today and over the last few weeks in the streets. And where it's getting confusing is that people are going, well, who's the enemy? Like, who hates black people? And there's nobody up there stepping up for the most part saying, I hate black people, right? Nobody's doing that. Because that's not the issue. There's a deeper issue of assumptions that we might have about people. And this is not a values thing. This is not about values. This is about like psychology, right? It is very normal and simple. And it's something we have to think about a lot, to just to group people into categories and say, oh, these type of people, they do this. Those type of people, they do that. And guess what? We, as Muslims, are dealing with that in a huge way right now, right? Some people are doing it in a real evil-like way. They're just trying to do it intentionally. But there's a lot of folks out there who, without any really bad intentions, who may know nothing about Muslims, who start to just absorb all the messages about what Muslims are and what is, right? Just by turning on the TV, right? And slowly but surely, those things start to it's just a normal psychological thing. You just absorb those messages, right? And so that average everyday person who doesn't know anything about Muslims absorbs these common messages about who they think we are. And then when they go out into the world and that little blink interaction where they see a brother with a beard and they see him as clearly Muslim, what do they think, right? They might immediately think, the T word or whatever, right? Something like that, right? Because, and again, not because they're evil, right? Some do, some are. I don't know. Some people have bad intentions, I'll put it like that. But some people they just don't know, right? And they just absorb it. This is how racism actually really works, right? So I'll use one more example with the Muslim community about racism that's directed towards us, and then I'm going to start to talk about within our community. So when you talk to everyday, so a lot of us go to the airport, and it's just brutal. It's the worst, it's anytime we have to go to the airport, it turns into like a disaster, right? We have to add an extra 2 to 3 hours or whatever to our time in the airport because there's always going to be, for us, some sort of secondary or tertiary screening, right? Everybody's got to go take off their shoes, right? Everybody's got to put their laptop, right? But when people look like us, or we have certain names, or we're coming from certain countries, right? Then there's this whole other process that a lot of us have had either gone through personally, or we've heard of folks who have to go through a process, right? And when you ask average Americans about this, or if they are aware of this, and I'm talking about not like people who have really bad intentions, they think this is okay. This is a country where we're trying to say, racism's done, and we have a process where we have, basically, racial profiling at airports, right? And the reason why most Americans are okay with this is because there's I'm going to put this in quotes, a common sense to it, right? There's this notion that they equate us with homeland security threat, right? And so therefore, okay, of course, right? If these are folks who equal homeland security threat, we need to make sure that they're safe, that we're safe from them, right? It's not, again, most people will not think of it as like, I'm a racist against Muslims. They'll just say, oh, this makes sense, right? In the same way, unfortunately, a lot of people make sense when unarmed black men get killed, and then people go, well, okay, right? And so we think of some of the trials of, we think of the trial of Trayvon Martin, so we're gonna move to something else, Trayvon Martin, right? He was an unarmed black male. He got killed by not even a police, I was gonna say by the police, by not a police officer, by a private citizen, who the police told him not to do anything. And so here's what seemed like a very simple case, right, of a vigilante who took it upon himself to kill an unarmed teen, right? But very quickly, the trial turned from what's wrong with this vigilante to putting Trayvon Martin on trial. So it was a lot of questions. Did he, what was his school record like? Did he use drugs, right? Did he he was wearing a hoodie, right? And it very quickly turned to, oh, now I can see why this guy might have actually killed this guy, even though he had no gun, right? Because they painted a picture of a young black man as dangerous, right? And that's what the black man, so while Muslims, for example, are dealing with this notion of Muslims as homeland security threat, African Americans, for example, are dealing with this notion of being dangerous or a thug, right? Hispanics right now are dealing with this notion of being illegal immigrants, right? And so on and so forth. And so we have to think, part of us can go, okay, look, we're Muslims, we're immune from this, we're immune from falling into these stereotypes, right? And I would say we do so at our own folly. We have to be very intentional about thinking about how to not fall into these traps, right? This is part of the test for us. I think too many times we just say, we've given ourselves the Islam, racism, vaccine, and say, okay, we're good, we're done. No, this is a process. This is a process, okay? So I'm gonna talk about a few things, because one of the things I was thinking about is, one of the things that's been so beautiful about what's going on with all these struggles, especially with the protests around the police issues with the African American communities, the way that our Muslim brothers and sisters have been involved in some of those protests. I think that's part of what we need to do. In the same way that it was nice to see when we were out there protesting against Gaza, the things that were happening in Gaza, how we had, folks joining us as well. So that's part of what we need to think about. But I want to think of, if we are really going to take a stance, right, against, and be the beacons that we are against racism in this society, we need to work at home as well. We need to figure out what we're doing amongst ourselves as well, too, right? And so I want to talk about a few things. So a few levels we can think about whether we have this type of justice in our own communities, okay? And the first way I'm going to talk about is in terms of our sisters. And I'm going to talk specifically to the brothers right now, okay? In terms of creating a Muslim community that's inclusive, right? And we're talking about, I've talked a lot about race, but let's talk about gender too, okay? We want to create a truly inclusive Muslim community so that we can then go out into the society and say, hey, let's help others create that inclusive community. We need to do that within our own community. And so one way to think about this is in terms of our sisters. So I'm going to talk to our brothers. Brothers, do you know, so when economists are fascinating. They're trying to find that one variable, that one thing. If we could just choose one thing that would help, everything, what would it be, right? And so when economists look at, what thing can best predict whether children are going to grow up healthy, whether people are going to grow up to, out of poverty, if they're going to have good health outcomes, the number one predictor of issues like that is maternal education. Right? So the more maternal education in the family, the more likely it is that the kids will be educated, the more likely that the family will be healthy, the more likely the family will be not poor, and so on and so on and so forth. Now, why do you think that is? Maternal education is the number one predictor of that. Well, if you think about it, I mean, if we just fall into thinking about the traditional roles or the stereotypical gender roles that we see in our communities, if for example, if dad is at work all day, right, and we think about the kids at home, whether they're going to school or whether they're being homeschooled or they're young, mom is the first teacher. Mom is the first teacher. And mom is usually the first, the second, and the last teacher. And to the extent that mom is educated, that is gonna make everything for that kid and that family much better. If mom does not have knowledge, if mom does not have education, it's gonna trickle down to the kids, even if you send them to school. I know somebody say, "Oh, just send them to school." School. I mean, you're with, if things are working out well, you are with your mother more than you're at school, in terms of time. So to my brothers, I issue us a challenge. We need to make time for our sisters to get educated. What does that mean? I'm talking now whether that means Islamic education, whether that means higher, getting a college degree or a graduate degree, that if we are creating a community in which we do not allow our women and our mothers, right, to get education, whatever that means, we are sinking our community. We're sinking our community. And brothers, I have a wife, I have 3 kids, I work at what sometimes feels like more than a full-time job. So believe me, I understand. There's a lot going on in the day. When is who's gonna watch the kids? Who's gonna make dinner? Look, it is not. We're doing our community an injustice if we do not figure out a way to make the time to watch our own kids, to make a few meals, to clean up the house, to do whatever it takes to make sure that every once in a while, hopefully more than every once in a while, our sisters have an opportunity to further their education. If we don't do that, if we say, look, dear wife or dear daughter or dear whoever, that would be great, but right, we are sinking our own community. So if we want to start about creating a truly inclusive community, and alhamdulillah, I'm gonna come back to this. I'll come back to that later. But we have to give our women an opportunity to get an education. Again, whether that's Islamic education or just a traditional education, whatever that means, we have to give them that opportunities, or we are sinking our own community. I cannot overstate that. Okay? And what the segues to is me as a psychologist, it makes me think about what our children see, right? Because we can say everything we want about whether, about being fair, about being just, about doing whatever, but they're gonna look at our actions. And that's what's gonna teach them more. We teach way more, our kids learn way more from just looking at us than what we tell them, okay? And so part of what this notion of helping the sisters in our communities getting educated is thinking about the young sisters in our community. What do they see for their future in life, right? When they look at their mom and they look at the sisters and the aunties in the community, do they see, opportunities? Do they see, their mothers, their aunties, their friends going on to get an education? Or are they seeing them being relegated to lives just at home? Okay? Because we can say whatever we want. We can say we do this for our women, we do that. We can say whatever we want, but they're going to look at us, and that's how they're going to learn. Okay, so that's one. In those regards, number 2, who do we spend our time with in our normal? And this is just us thinking about our normal lives. I'm thinking on an individual level. Who do we spend our time with? So we can say, like, I'm not, I don't harbor any bad feelings about this person or these group or that group, but do you spend time with these folks? Right? Do you actually go and and what's great to look out here is just to see the diversity in this audience. But you go to some masajid and it's this group over here, that group over there, right? Or we think about, I hear all the time, I talk to kids, I talk to youth in our community all the time. My parents won't let me marry a fill in the blank ethnicity, right? If they're Pakistani, they won't let me marry an Arab. Or an Arab says, no, they can't. My parents won't let me marry an African American, right? Things like that. Who do we consort with? Who are our close friends? Who do we tell our children? Yes, play with them. No, don't play with them. We can say, look, you can play with, my children. I tell them they can play with whoever they want. But who do they actually play with? Right? Again, we can tell them whatever we want, but who do they play with? Who do they see you playing with? Even more importantly, right? If you say yes, because I know part of what we're thinking is going, oh yes, look, mashallah, our children, they're American, they don't care what you are, they interact across this, that, and the other, but they're still looking at us. It's not over just because they're kids, they still look at us and they still look up to the elders, and if they see our elders segregating themselves, and good. And is there good reasons? Yes, I understand. Some of us by language, right? We want to be able to speak to someone our own language. That's great. That's fine. But to the extent that becomes like a systematic, institutionalized way that we interact with each other, I come in and I find the brothers from my country, or I come into the mess and I find the brothers who speak my language only, right? Or I see these brothers, but we never interact with them. My kids never play with them, right? or I tell them, no, you can't marry that, we need to marry, right? That's a problem. That is a problem. And so the second thing we need to think about is who are we actually interacting with? And so another way to really think about that is us going out of our way to know people who are different, right? Remember, Allah said, you made us into tribes so that we may know one another, right? A lot of us, for example, and it makes sense. A lot of us, for example, many of us know or are learning Arabic. And of course, it makes sense, right? Because the language of the Quran is Arabic, right? But how many of us go out of our ways to learn the language of the members of our communities? Not even the whole language, but just how to say hello to our brothers from Somalia, right? Or our Urdu-speaking brothers, right? Do we create, yes, does it make sense for us to learn Arabic? Of course, because we have to learn how to read the Quran, right? But if we only learn Arabic, right? How do we? It creates environments where Arab speakers feel really comfortable coming in here, or not here, just places. But what about people who don't speak Arabic? Do we go out of our way? Right? I'll speak to myself. I have plenty of friends who are from Urdu-speaking families. Do I know a word of Urdu? And the answer is no, and that's wrong. That's wrong. So what are we doing in our own lives to live this notion of actually getting to know one another and reaching across these lines? We can say it all we want, but are we interacting with folks besides just saying Assalamu alaikum and then keep it moving, and then I'm going to go just have my real friendship with these folks over here, and my social circle with these folks over here, and my kids only interact with these social circles? So that's something we need to think about. And then the third level to think about this on is our masajid, or at least I'll put it like this, our community centers. Because this is what I'm most worried about for our kids, right? Because this is where they are really looking. This is where they come to the cultural centers, and they're learning by watching. Okay? And so things to think about, whether it's this, wherever you are, wherever your cultural center, your home, masjid is. If I walked into that cultural center, right, and I didn't know anything about anything, and I just sort of looked around and I figured out, well, is this a place where, what do people, what do the different people do here, right? So in other words, thinking about things like, I go into a masjid and I look at this wonderfully diverse, congregation, right? I'm not this masjid, any masjid, whatever, right? And it's a wonderfully diverse, congregation, right? But then I look at the board, right? Does the board reflect the diversity of the people there, right? Or who's doing what roles, right? In the cultural center, right? Are certain groups of people like the ones who take control of the kitchen, and certain groups the ones who take control of security, and certain groups who do this or do that, right? Then our kids look, right? And our kids go, well, what am I? Okay, I fall into this group, therefore this is what my future is. Security. The kitchen. The board. Whatever that is. But to the extent that we have these issues where we have certain, I'm not saying this is what's happening here, I'm just thinking about my experiences in masajid across the Northeast and other places. To the extent that we have a diverse community, but that diversity is not reflected across the board. We just see certain people doing this, and this group doing that, and this group doing that. That's what the kids learn. And so we can say, Islam doesn't have racism, and Islam doesn't divide by race, right? But except if we go into our cultural centers and we're seeing so-and-so group doing this, so-and-so group doing this, and so-and-so group doing that. That's right. And remember the beginning of my talk. This is not about intentions, right? And this is where it gets hard. This is not about intentions. This is not. I highly doubt someone goes into a diverse masjid and then says, okay, all the so-and-so brothers, we're just going to take over. Nobody does that. But sometimes that just happens, right? And it happens usually because there's a lack of intentionality. Here's what usually happens. This is the problem. This is the problem in America and in our masjid, right? And I'm going to say it's about intentionality. I'm going to use Boston as an example. And it was 1954 when the Supreme Court of the United States said, you know what, we have these segregated schools in the United States by race, and and that is over. That is illegal, okay? 1954, okay? It was until 1974, 20 years later, This is after the Supreme Court, the biggest court in the country, said this is illegal. It took 20 years, and on top of that, a mandate from a federal judge. So it was 1974, right? In Boston, which is the liberal bastion of the United States and equality, right? 20 years after the Supreme Court said this is illegal, for a federal judge to say you have to segregate your schools, Boston, right? And when the federal judge said you have to desegregate the schools, the school committee said no. And the school committee was held in contempt, and they were actually forced, like physically forced, to desegregate the schools in Boston. Now, what does that mean? We had laws that said this is illegal, right? And so you could have these principles that say, you can have these laws, these values and principles that say equality for this or that, but sometimes you actually have to like make somebody do it. Because if you just let people just do it by their own accord, it doesn't happen, right? So so using the example of the desegregation, we just issued a decree that said, it was more of just like a value. It said, no, we can't do this. But then you actually had to go and make Boston actually do it. Kicking and screaming, I'm telling you, they had police escorts taking kids in school buses to these schools because there was literally riot zones in front of these schools. Because they didn't want this to happen, okay? So what it required, so if you think about some of what happened with the civil rights laws in this country, we created laws, and then you actually had to create another set of laws and policies to say, you actually have to do this, right? Do you see what I'm saying? There were laws that said, these are illegal, these things are illegal, these forms of discrimination are illegal. And then people just said, nah, I don't care, right? And then they had to come back again and say, no, now we have to create these policies. You've heard the term affirmative action, right? That says like, if you have to do this. And so what we have to do is think about in our communities. Here's what happens in the United States and in our communities in general. We'll say things like, we use voting as an example. Everybody has, it's been written in the Constitution that all men have the right to vote since the very beginning of the United States. But then we had to create another set of amendments that said, actually, we explicitly give black people the right to vote, right? Because we had to, because we weren't doing it. And so when we say these things, so how does that relate to our community? So here's what I think happens oftentimes. Here's where we get these situations where we get the divisions. Something like this happens. It goes, okay, brothers and sisters, we were having, I'll use the board as an example. We're having elections for the board. Anybody can run. Anybody anybody can self-nominate or nominate whoever you want, and then we go from there, okay? And that, in a lot of ways, seems to make so people are like, what's the problem with that, right? Of course, right? It's a very simple way. Like, it's open to anybody, no one's left out, right? Maybe you might have a few parameters, you have to be a member or whatever, but like, for the most part, it's open to everybody, nobody's left out. But what happens? What happens is, little simple things happen where, if you're not intentional about it, again, you might have really great intentions, but, so-and-so's friend, and you decide to run, and the next thing you know, all of a sudden, the people who decide to step up, usually the people who decide to step up are the people who feel most empowered, right? And the people who don't step up to volunteer are the people who feel like, this place is not really for me, right? So again, think of that kid who's looking around and saying like, what do people who look like me do in this place, right? And they look, or even the adult who says, what do people who look like me do in this place? And they might see like, well, I don't see many people who look like me on the board. That doesn't look like a place for me that's, welcome. Nobody said anything. Nobody said, no, you can't. Everyone said, go. But what happens is, common sense takes over. The groups form, and then you get this thing where specific people take over. Now, here's how you subvert that. What you do is you say, look, as the leadership of your community, you say, okay, who is my community, right? Who's my community? Who's here? Like what's the wonderful diversity that I have here? Who are the different tribes, the different families, right? And then go to them and say, we are trying to create an inclusive board here. We really are encouraging someone from your community to run, right? And make sure that you actually, rather than saying, anybody who wants to run runs, right? And then a certain group takes over, and that sort of just takes itself over. It's hard to break that up. And actually saying, look, we want to brother, sister, and again, not just by race, another way to think about it is by gender too, but brother, sister from so-and-so community. We need someone from your community to run. You're such a wonderful part of our community. We want to make sure your voices and your concerns are heard. And so from this community and that part of the community, it's actually going to folks and intentionally trying to create the diversity rather than just saying, we're diverse. Anybody wants that, runs, and then we'll just see what happens. Because what usually happens in history and in general is that people with privilege have power and take it over. People who don't have privilege don't. Okay? So I guess what I'm really trying to think about is I'm thinking about my daughter. I'm thinking of my oldest daughter. She's 10. She's African American. She's Muslim. And I'm thinking about when she comes to, the masjid my home masjid in Sharon, or when she comes to ISBCC, or wherever she's with her community, what is she actually learning about who she can become? Right? We can, and by what is she learning? I don't mean by what are we telling her, I said, what are we showing her? And we can argue about this, but if my daughter, just think about your own cultural center, your own masjid. If my daughter wanted to become a board member and wanted to become like someone who really made that cultural center or that masjid like, the best place that it could be, would she envision that future for herself based on what she's seeing? And if the answer is no, then we have work to do. And I think, unfortunately, we all too often, we do have work to do. And I think we're in a much better place because we're coming from a place as a community that says, we know this is wrong, right? And we know that we're already in these one, like, again, looking out into this audience, it's just beautiful to see the diverse audience that we have, but we need to, like, it's a process. This issue of creating justice around these issues there's no end zone. There's no like, okay, now we made it, right? It's an ongoing process. It's a process of constantly thinking, who's our community, right? Are we making sure that voices from across the community are being heard equally, right? Are we seeking out the voices that are silent right now, for whatever reasons, for good or bad reasons, right? Are we giving everyone in our communities opportunities to educate themselves, to put themselves into leadership positions? These are the questions and I'm not saying that that's not happening here. And one of the things, I'll just give you a great example of what is happening here. There's a lot of places where, for example, and this is what I love about this place, where the brothers are here and the sisters are way back there. Right? Which creates this opportunity, this scenario where, like, when the sisters have questions, it's like, sister, what? So I love how we have this thing going on here, right? We can still stick to our principles as Muslims without creating a scenario where, am I running out of time already? Is it not? I'm almost done. Where where our sisters can actually participate and actually hear and listen, right? And it was so great, mashallah, to have how many times does a sister come up and actually introduce the speaker? So what I was thinking when that happened is if my daughter came here, she would see herself she could see herself as a leader in this community, right? Because she came up because she would have seen someone who looked like her up here introducing the halakha speaker, right? And so we need to and so obviously that process is happening here at ISBCC, and we need to, and it has to continue. It has to continue. And we always have to constantly be seeking to do better and always thinking about which voices are silent. Why is that? Let's go to them and make sure that we are doing everything we can to hear their voices and elevate their voices and give them a sense of power and privilege to be a part of this, a true member of this community, okay? And then we'll be in an even better place to really live the spirit of that verse, of really knowing one another, right? And really giving people, and really creating an inclusive community, and therefore really having the practice within our own community to then take it out into the broader community where this work in the United States needs to be done, because there's still issues of racial injustice going on. And so we are perfectly positioned in this building, right, where this building is actually located, right, to be at the center of these conversations on Malcolm X Boulevard, right? Right? Around these issues, and being at the forefront of showing this country what racial equality and justice should actually look like. But we really have to do a better job, an even better job of practicing it ourselves in our own communities. That's all I want to say for now. So I really appreciate the opportunity, Jazakallah khair.